I want to welcome our very first keynote of this series, Alex Shevrin Venet, who's an educator, an author, someone who facilitates professional development, who I have really enjoyed being in inquiry with through your writing, Alex, and live and in the flesh through Zoom. So when I hand it over to you, I thank you so much for being here. And yeah.
Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, based on where you are. It is so wonderful to be with you. My name is Alex Shevrin Venet. I use she, her pronouns. I'm Zooming at you from Winooski, Vermont, where it is cloudy and a little gray today, but kind of nice and cool, which I'm enjoying. On the slide here is how to find me online if you'd like to. I just want to echo something Oriana said earlier, which is I would love if you would engage with the chat or your emoji responses as I'm speaking. There's going to be a couple of particular moments where I'm going to invite you to participate in a specific way in the chat, but I love to sort of watch the stream of your reactions flow by. So feel free to be in there as much or as little as you'd like to. So our theme of today is this idea of renewing ourselves, renewing our work for the year and for the future. And as I was thinking about today, I kept coming back to this concept called the tragic gap. The idea is that, right now, we are living through times of collective trauma. We are living through times of collective stress. There's one particular definition of trauma that goes, trauma is when stressful and dangerous circumstances overwhelm our capacity to cope. And we often apply that to the individual, but it's also collective, right? And I think that as educators, we are extremely well positioned to see and witness our collective inability to cope with the stress and danger that is all around us. Educators are often on the front line of witnessing what happens when that capacity to cope is overwhelmed. And I know that most educators that I speak to are feeling really tired, really, really tired of the last few years and seeing what happens when the needs of our students simply aren't being met by the system that's around us. When we see the hardship that folks are going through, and we can just picture, I feel like I know what could fix this, but the resource isn't there. I'm the resource, I'm there, and I can't do it all for all of these young people within my care. I can't even do it all for myself. The tragic gap is this phrase from an educator named Parker Palmer. We're going to come back to him in just a minute. But it refers to this idea that there is a distance between what we see and what we dream could be. And I have been thinking about this a lot because recently I wrote a book about school change and kind of how we gather our skills and strategies for making change in spite of all the collective trauma or through all the collective trauma. And I have this chapter in the book that's all about dreaming. It's all about visioning what's possible and really connecting to our wildest imaginations of what would school look like if based in justice. What would a healing school look like? Really living in those possibilities. And at the end of the chapter, I had these couple of reflection questions about, what's the distance between you and those dreams? And what does it feel like to stand in that gap, that distance? And as I finished the manuscript of my book, I sent it to a friend of mine, Shanae Bond, who's an amazing educator and writer and all around great human. I sent it to her for some feedback. And when she got to that chapter, she said, I really like this idea of dreaming. It's so important. But you have this reflection question here about how does it feel to stand in that gap? And Alex, I need more. I need you to tell me what to do because it feels really, really hard to stand in that gap. we're there. We're all in that place between what is and what could be. And so how do I move through that? What am I supposed to do with that? And so I really took her challenge seriously, and I wanted to write more about how do we deal with that? How do we move through it? And so I turned to my dude, Parker Palmer. Parker Palmer is an educator, a poet, and an author. His work's amazing. If you've never picked up his book, The Courage to Teach, you need it. It's a great one to dip into right before the start of the school year. So I highly recommend it. In a different book, Parker Palmer writes about this concept of the tragic gap, and we're going to unpack a couple of things that he says about it together. Let me read to you for a minute. Parker Palmer writes this about the tragic gap. Of all the tensions we must hold in personal and political life, perhaps the most fundamental and most challenging is standing and acting with hope in the tragic gap. On one side of that gap, we see the hard realities of the world, realities that can crush our spirits and defeat our hopes. On the other side of that gap, we see real-world possibilities, life as we know it, because we have seen it that way. We see a world at war, but we have known moments of peace. We see racial and religious enmity, but we have known moments of unity. We see suffering caused by unjust scarcities, but we have known moments of material and spiritual sharing in which abundance was generated. Possibilities of this sort are not wishful dreams or fantasies. They are alternatives that we have witnessed in our own lives. Possibilities of this sort are not wishful dreams or fantasies. They are alternatives that we have seen, we have witnessed in our own lives. Chills. So digging into this writing about the tragic gap, it shifted something in my mind, because when I think of the tragic gap, I think of a chasm, right? Like you're on a mountain and there's like a deep ravine. And I pictured the tragic gap as me standing over here in what is, and then looking across the ravine at what's possible. And the tragic gap is in between us. But actually what Parker Palmer, I think, is saying here is that the future and the present are both on this side of the ravine. We're actually standing in both things. And maybe the ravine, that gap that we're looking at, is about the unknown and is about possibilities and is about change. But actually, the things that we dream about, the things that we picture, are already here a little bit, right? There are alternatives that we have seen. And I love this because I think that most educators really relate to this, that we live in these scarcities, right? We live in conflict. We live in not enough support, not enough resources. We live with our profession being attacked, all of these pieces. And at the same time, we've had those little moments in our classroom where a kid is crying and another kid who's not even friends with them walks over and puts their hand on their shoulder and says, "It's okay to cry." We've had those moments where our high schoolers who are too cool for school and don't ever want to be vulnerable actually decide that today they're going to sit in the circle we're facilitating, and maybe really grudgingly, but they're still going to share something. We've had these moments where there's scarcity of resources, but we post on a community newsletter and someone says, "I have a desk I can bring. I have an extra rug I'm not using. Let me bring it into your classroom," right? These possibilities of abundance, of community, of healing, they're actually things that we've experienced. They're already here. So the dreaming isn't necessarily about, what can I invent with rainbows and unicorns and, things that aren't actually possible, but how do I dream of these moments that I have seen expanding and becoming bigger and becoming more real? And so I want us to reflect on this a little bit and reflect on this idea that we see currently the scarcities, the challenges, the realities, and at the same time, we also have experienced some of those possibilities. So I would love if you could take a moment and reflect on this yourself, of a sort of dual statement, and you can fill this in right in the chat. A reality that you see that maybe reflects some of the harshness of our current reality, and at the same time, have you seen a moment of an alternative possibility? So take a minute, reflect, and if you'd like to share an example in the chat, I would love to see them. I see blaming others, but I have known moments of coming together. I see burnout, but I've known moments of community building. I see suicide rates, and I have known moments of an increase in support. I see anger and pain, but I have known moments of connection and vulnerability and truly offering trust and being a receiver of that grief. I see getting paid poverty wages for our degrees and our work. And I have known removing things, the greed from the top, and restructuring education to center fair compensation. I see hopelessness, but I have known moments of radical trust in community. I see sadness, but I have known ecstatic joy when grieving. There are many beautiful examples here. I'm only catching some of them as I scroll, but I would encourage you to scroll a little bit, and maybe one of our SCRR folks will collect these examples as well for reflection at another time, because these are really beautiful experiences that we're looking at. If you're still typing, keep typing, because I want to keep seeing some of these examples. And I want us to really notice this idea of both and. Both and, to me, is one of the most powerful concepts that we can connect with to renew ourselves in the time of collective trauma and renew ourselves in the face of the tragic gap. Both and is kind of a shorthand phrase that is in opposition to the idea of either or, although I guess it's ironic that it's in opposition to. So let's call it on a spectrum from either or. Both and calls us to remember that multiple truths can be present at the same time, even if, and maybe especially if, those truths feel really conflicting. All of these examples that you're sharing in the chat are examples of both and, this idea that we see these realities and we have experienced these moments of possibility. We see how things are and we imagine how they could be because they are already that way in these small moments. This orientation towards both and is something that I continually return to, because either or thinking is actually sometimes a sign of burnout, and it's actually sometimes a sign of vicarious trauma or secondary traumatic stress. When we are overloaded with stress, our ability to live in the nuance decreases because our brain is trying to protect us, and it is easier from a survival standpoint to categorize things as safe, unsafe, good, bad, right? And so it is an act of resilience and resilience building to really lean into the nuance of both and say, not everything is either or. I can live with these conflicting truths, and I can try to explore what it means to work through that kind of mess in the middle, as opposed to trying to make up my mind one way or another way. In a lot of ways, embracing the both and is how teachers get through the day, right? You know that you're going to work for a very broken system. You know that you're going to spend more time than you're being paid for. You know that you are not going to be able to meet all the needs of your students. And you are going to work in a system that you at least have some hope for. You know that you are going to spend the time that you feel is going to make your students feel welcomed and safe and seen. You know that you can't meet every need, but you can meet some needs, and that is good enough. And so embracing this both and to me is a really powerful way to just renew our intentions for the year. It doesn't have to be one or the other. I can live in this gray. And so let's come back then to another piece that Parker Palmer adds about the tragic gap. He says, in every generation, we must try again to close the gap between our reality and our aspirations. That gap will always be open, and the hearts of those who try to close it will always be broken. In every generation, we must try again to close the gap between our reality and our aspirations. That gap will always be open, and the hearts of those who try to close it will always be broken. I want to break this quote down in two different pieces. I want to look at that last sentence because what a sentence. Let's talk about it, Parker Palmer. The gap will always be open. When you read that sentence, there's a part of me that wants to go, well, that's depressing, whatever, I'm giving up, right? There's a part of us that goes, oh, as hard as I work in my lifetime, these inequities are going to persist. As long as I work in the education ecosystem, we're never going to get to these visions that I have. This tragic gap, this ravine, it's not going to close. Like, ugh. But it's actually, I think, a really hopeful statement in a different way. Because if we know that we're actually not going to get across this tragic gap in our lifetime, if we know that there will always be a distance between what is and what is possible, then in some ways it frees us up a little bit, right? Because my goal is no longer to try to speed my way across the ravine. It's no longer to try to, let's go, let's get there. Instead, it's about being present now and what can I do in this moment, given that that gap will always be open. I really like this phrase, the process is the point. It really calls us to this idea that if the end goal is so distant, then what it really matters right now is the process that we're using to get there. And so this calls me back again to this idea of I know these moments of possibility exist right now. And so if the process of trying to move closer to closing that tragic gap is really all I have to do, then how can I lean into that, right? How can I make it count with what I'm trying now? It makes me focus on the present moment while holding those possibilities in my mind. And it makes me think about what I can do now. So can I experiment with different pieces in my community, in my classroom, in my school, experiment as if those possibilities were bigger and more persistent than they are? Could I try something, right? Could I say, you know what? I feel like the students are having a really hard time. I'm not really sure that we're going to get to this community that I dream of, but I'm just going to try it out. I'm going to invite them into this process with me and see what happens. If the process is the point, I might think about how could I document and celebrate these moments of possibility, right? Those moments of possibility that Palmer talks about that we see right now, those little moments. Okay, well, if the process is what I have to focus on, then how about I slow down, right? We entered this day thinking of slowing down. When I have that moment where the student walks over and puts their hand on their classmate's shoulder and says, it's okay to cry, how do I pause and celebrate and uplift that? How do I make sure that I'm calling at the end of the day to family and saying, it was just a beautiful moment that I witnessed? How do I make sure I write that in my own journal so that on Friday, when I feel like pulling out my hair because no one listened to me all day, I go, yes, but I had this moment this week that was absolutely beautiful. If the process is what I have right now, maybe I want to invite others to dream with me so that even if we're not going to get across this ravine together, we're all imagining it together. We're all picturing it. We're all expanding on these possibilities. So what are those pieces that I can do that actually bring some of those far-reaching dreams into the current moment? And that dreaming is necessary, right? As Palmer said, it's not about being unrealistic. It's not about like detaching ourselves from reality. But we can get really, really good at admiring the problem, right? We're so good at this as teachers. Like we are so good at sitting around and going, I hate this stupid building. These cinder blocks are so annoying. It's always too hot or too cold in my room. I never get enough support from the central office. We're so good at it. And it's not about turning away and ignoring all of that. But the dreaming aspect is so important to just keep fueling us. And when we recognize that dreaming is about finding those current moments of possibility and really leaning into them, then I think it just becomes beautiful. It's like, what are the, it reminds me of if you've ever gardened or anything like that, and at the beginning of the season, like you see these little sprouts, or you see the plant that you saw grow last year, and right now it just kind of looks like a weed, and you're like, okay, but if I just wait a couple months and I keep watering this, it's going to be really beautiful because I saw it last year, right? And so that dreaming to sort of just guide our intentions and keep us going is so, so important. And this brings us back to this both and aspect, that as we are doing that dreaming, it does throw the reality of today into stark relief. It does make us really feel what Shanae had talked to me about when she gave me feedback on that manuscript. Like, how do I actually work through the pain of the tragic gap? And I always return, there's a really beautiful essay by Jeffrey Duncan Andrade, about radical hope in education. And he says the painful path is the hopeful path. This idea that we actually don't have to let go of how hard it is. We actually don't have to let go of the difficulty in order to have hope. Like, what if we actually leaned into that? And so that brings me back to the other part of this quote that I wanted to look at together. So Palmer writes, the gap will always be open, and the hearts of those who try to close it will always be broken. So let's talk about that very last piece. The hearts of those who try to close it will always be broken. Again, this could be really upsetting to go, okay, I'm always going to be miserable because this gap will always be open. But I started really thinking about, like, what is it to be brokenhearted, right? I started thinking about times when my heart has been broken by relationships or by grief or by the state of the world. And there's something about brokenheartedness. I was reminded of, I'm not going to sing to you, but the Simon and Garfunkel song where it's Graceland, where it's like, losing love is like a window to your heart. It just made me think of this open heartedness that comes with broken heartedness. When your heart is broken, sometimes you feel like the barrier between you and the world is thinner, that you maybe are more in touch with other people's pain because you are also in pain, that you sort of have this empathy that is connective, right? That you relate to all the art about other people's pain and grief. You see other people's experience reflected in your own and vice versa. And so when I think about this idea of moving in a broken-hearted way, what I actually am thinking is, it's an open-hearted way. It's a way of embracing that the hopeful path is the painful path. And so what if I'm going to let go of the toxic positivity that education spaces want me to have? And I'm not going to say, this year is the best ever, and we're just going to make it work, and it's all going to be great. But I say, there are real challenges. There is real pain, and I am not going to meet everyone's needs. And I am still going to enter this the best that I can, and I'm still going to do the work. And so it just makes me really imagine a possibility of moving from a place of brokenheartedness instead of trying to shove it to the side. And so I'd like to invite you again to just imagine a little bit, and this is a little more abstract. So, if you're with me, you can throw in an example. If you need to think about it more, you're good. But I'd love to hear if anyone is thinking about, ways that you could move from that brokenheartedness. What would it look like to do your work from a place of that openness to grief and pain and loss and trauma and collective trauma? What does it look like to actually do your work from that place, rather than from a place of toxic positivity or pushing it to the side or denial? I'll just leave it open for a minute in the chat if anyone is thinking about what would that look like for you. Yes, acknowledging that grief and joy coexist. I think a lot about how often we ask students things like, what was the best part of your day? What was your favorite thing? What was, we keep it really positive, and we don't always invite students into, what are you holding today? What did you hate about this unit? Like, what did you, what are you struggling with this year? So really inviting in the range of emotions is a beautiful way to move from that brokenheartedness. Carrying some of that pain as motivation, being real and authentic, modeling and inviting that vulnerability. Oh, I see a beautiful response about staying in integrity with ourselves and then processing the pain of doing so. That makes me think of that concept of moral injury, which is, when we have to act in ways for our job that really pull against our integrity, which most educators are really familiar with. You won't have all the answers after your heart is broken, but the mess is where the beauty lives. I want that embroidered on a pillow. That's really, that's beautiful. Oh, I see a quote from Mariam Kaba in the chat. It helps me remember to focus on my sphere of influence. There's so much I can't control. Mariam Kaba says, hope is a discipline. Absolutely. Resting. Yes, one of the pieces of brokenheartedness is that when we're in grief and pain and loss and brokenheartedness, often we really kind of burrow into that, right? Like the Netflix on the couch with the chocolate, or the long walks, or the quiet reflection is where many of us will turn in brokenheartedness. And what if we thought about that as a model for sustaining ourselves in this year of, instead of self-care, what if I thought about, how do I actually tend my broken heart this year? I'm not going to focus on self-care. I'm going to focus on, well, I guess you could call it a form of self-care, but what if I tend my broken heart as a way of caring for myself? Yes, and slowing down, sitting in that muck. We don't have to rush through grief because it's uncomfortable. It has important lessons to teach us. That's a comment from the chat. That's absolutely beautiful. Yes. So this is what I want to invite us all into, right? That as we think about this idea of the tragic gap, right? That gap between our hope of where things might be and where we are presently, it doesn't have to be about, how do I get there faster? It doesn't have to be about, how do I deal with these emotions so I don't have to think about them anymore? But it actually kind of looks like leaning in, right? Leaning into what's hard about it, leaning into the both and then allowing that friction to really sustain us. And so where I want to leave you all with today is this both and, that as you go into your year, you can't do it all. In the system that we are given in our current reality, we cannot meet every need that our students have. We cannot meet every need that we have professionally or personally. We can't change everything individually. And collectively, we can do a lot, but we can't do it all, because as Parker Palmer says, the gap is always going to be open. And at the same time, we all have a place we can begin, whether that is that experimentation or celebration or modeling vulnerability, or simply showing up as your whole self, or allowing someone else to do that, or inviting them to do so. There are so many places that you can gather with those around you and say, that ravine is pretty far, but it's going to be easier if we go there together. And so I want you to, as you go through the days of this institute, as you make your preparations for the year, really be paying attention to, what is my place to begin? Is there a practice that I can pull from this experience that I want to integrate into my life and my work? Is there a person at this institute I want to connect with and learn more from? Is there a text that I want to lean into? Is there a phrase or a word that I want to set as my intention? Keep your ears and your eyes and your heart open for some of those pieces. And I think that you'll find that you have some of that renewal as you go into your work. I hope you do. Thank you all so, so much. Your engagement has been just beautiful, and thank you all.